A racist cop belittles a black waitress in a diner, but when a shocking secret ties their lives together, his prejudice and career are thrown into chaos. Can love and truth conquer hate, or will it all end in disaster? The final twist will leave you shocked. The morning was already heavy with tension. Officer Mike Reynolds stepped into the small-town diner, his boots thudding against the tiled floor. His uniform, though neatly pressed, carried the arrogance of authority. He glanced around, his expression cold, dismissing the lively hum of chatter as beneath him. For Mike, the diner was just a pit stop, a quick coffee before heading out to patrol. Behind the counter stood Maya Carter, a black waitress in her late 20s, with an easy smile and an air of calm that brightened the room. Maya had worked at the diner for years, balancing shifts while caring for her younger brother at home. She was used to rude customers. Small-town life came with its share of challenges, but something about Mike's piercing glare put her on edge. Mike approached the counter, his sharp eyes scanning the room before locking onto Maya. "Coffee, black," he barked, not even glancing at the menu. Maya, unfazed, nodded politely. "Sure thing, sir. Coming right up." As she turned to grab the pot of coffee, she heard him mutter, just loud enough for her to hear, "Figures." Lazy service as usual. Maya froze for a split second, the words stinging like a slap. She steadied herself, swallowing the anger rising in her chest. Years of enduring subtle, and sometimes not so subtle prejudices had taught her to choose her battles carefully. She placed the cup of coffee in front of him with a calm smile, her voice unwavering. "Here you go. Anything else?" Mike raised an eyebrow, smirking. "How about a little speed next time? Or is that too much to ask?" The din of the diner seemed to quiet as a few heads turned, sensing the tension. Maya took a deep breath, her hands tightening around the edges of her apron. She had dealt with this kind of behavior before, but it never got easier. "No problem, sir," she replied, her tone firm yet polite. Mike leaned back in his seat, clearly enjoying the power dynamic. To him, Maya was just another face in a long line of people he didn't care to know. He saw her through the narrow lens of his own prejudices, not as a person with a story, struggles, or dreams. As Maya walked away, her composure cracked for a moment. She stepped into the back room, leaning against the wall, her chest tightening. She thought of her younger brother, Ethan, who looked up to her as both a sister and a parent. She couldn't afford to lose this job, no matter how much it stung to endure the casual cruelty of people like Mike. Back at the counter, Mike's radio buzzed faintly, pulling his attention to the day's mundane duties. He sipped his coffee, oblivious to the ripple of discomfort he had caused. But for Maya, the moment lingered like a bruise, one she had learned to carry with silent strength. Yet neither of them knew that this seemingly ordinary encounter was the beginning of something extraordinary. Their lives, so vastly different, were about to collide in ways neither could have imagined. As Maya returned to the counter, a customer at the far end of the diner waved her over, unknowingly setting into motion a chain of events that would unravel the secrets of her past, and Mike's. Maya approached the far end of the diner, her smile returning as she greeted an older man who had just sat down. He was a regular, a retired teacher named Mr. Grayson. Always kind, always tipping generously. But as Maya took his order, she felt the weight of Mike's gaze burning into her back. His presence was like a dark cloud, looming and oppressive. "Everything okay, Maya?" Mr. Grayson asked, his soft voice laced with concern. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, just a busy morning," she replied, forcing a smile. But it wasn't okay, not really. Maya had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about Mike's disdain felt personal, like an attack on the very core of who she was. As she returned to the counter to pour Mr. Grayson's coffee, Mike's voice cut through the air again, sharper this time. "Hey, waitress, you forget about me already?" The diner grew quieter, the clatter of forks and coffee cups slowing, as other customers sensed the growing tension. Maya clenched her jaw, willing herself to remain calm. "No, sir," she said, turning toward him. "Is there something else you need?" Mike smirked, leaning back in his seat. "Just wondering if you treat all your customers like this, or if it's just me. Maybe I should talk to your manager." A murmur ran through the room. Maya felt her heart pound, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She glanced toward the kitchen door, where her manager, Linda, was peeking out, clearly uneasy but unwilling to intervene. "I apologize if I've upset you, sir," Maya said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. Mike's smirk widened, clearly enjoying the power he held over her. But before he could respond, the door to the diner swung open, and a man walked in. The newcomer was tall, with a confident stride and an air of familiarity. He wore a worn leather jacket, his face lined with years of hard work and quiet wisdom. Maya's eyes widened as she recognized him. "Uncle Robert?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, his face lighting up with a warm smile. "Hey, kiddo. Thought I'd stop by and surprise you." Maya rushed around the counter, throwing her arms around him. For a moment, the tension in the diner lifted as the two embraced. But as they pulled apart, Mike's voice cut through the brief moment of joy. "Well, isn't this touching?" he drawled, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Robert turned toward the voice, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the uniformed officer. The air seemed to grow heavier as the two men locked eyes. "Is there a problem here?" Robert asked, his voice calm but firm. Mike raised an eyebrow, sizing up the older man. "No problem. Just making sure everyone's doing their job," he replied, his smirk still in place. Maya placed a hand on her uncle's arm, a silent plea to let it go. But Robert didn't budge. He stepped closer to Mike, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Funny thing about jobs," Robert said, his voice low enough that only Mike could hear. "Some of us work to protect and serve. Others work to tear people down." Mike's smirk faltered, just for a moment. Something about Robert's presence was unsettling, though he couldn't quite place why. "Do I know you?" Mike asked, his tone shifting slightly. Robert didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to Maya and gave her a reassuring nod. "Don't let people like this get to you, kid. They're not worth it." Maya felt a lump rise in her throat, a mix of gratitude and lingering anger. But as Robert turned back to Mike, his expression hardened. "You might want to watch how you treat people," Robert said, his voice steady. "You never know when it might come back to bite you." With that, Robert turned and walked toward a booth near the window, leaving Mike to stew in his own discomfort. As Maya brought Robert his coffee, Mike pulled out his phone, his brow furrowed. Something about the man's face nagged at him, like a distant memory he couldn't quite grasp. He tapped into the department's database, searching for answers, unaware that the secret he was about to uncover would unravel both their lives. Mike sat at the counter, his coffee now cold as he stared at his phone. His fingers hovered over the department's internal database, hesitating for reasons he couldn't explain. He typed Robert Carter into the search bar, his curiosity outweighing the unease that gnawed at him. A list of results popped up: old police reports, citations, and an incident from over 2 decades ago. His eyes narrowed as he clicked on one of the files. A grainy photo of Robert stared back at him, younger but unmistakable. Below it, a case title that sent a chill down Mike's spine: Officer Involved Shooting, Suspect Robert Carter. The memory hit him like a freight train. Mike remembered his father, a retired officer, talking about a case from years ago. It had been a point of pride for his father, a moment when justice, in his words, was served. But now, as Mike read the report, the details seemed far less noble. The report described an altercation in a predominantly black neighborhood. Robert had been accused of trespassing on a property that wasn't his, but the details were murky. Witnesses claimed he was just passing through, yet officers, including Mike's father, had escalated the situation. The case ended with Robert being shot in the shoulder, though he was unarmed and later cleared of any wrongdoing. Mike scrolled further and saw Robert's mugshot. The defiance in his eyes was unmistakable, but what stood out most was the section marked Case outcome. It read, dismissed, insufficient evidence. Mike's stomach churned. He had always admired his father as a hero, someone who upheld the law. But now, cracks in that image began to form. He glanced up at Robert, who was sitting in the corner booth with Maya, laughing softly as she leaned in close to speak with him. The warmth between them was palpable, and for the first time, Mike noticed how Maya's smile had a way of lighting up the room. But then another thought crept in, one that Mike couldn't ignore. If Robert was Maya's uncle, then their connection to his family's past ran deeper than he could have imagined. At the booth, Maya sat across from Robert, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. "You didn't have to step in back there," she said softly. "I can handle guys like him." Robert shook his head, his expression firm. "It's not about handling it, Maya. It's about making sure people like him know they can't keep getting away with it." Maya sighed. "It's just not worth the fight sometimes. I have enough on my plate without adding trouble to the mix." Robert's face softened. "You're stronger than you realize, kiddo. But you don't have to do it all alone. You've got me. Always." Before she could respond, a shadow loomed over their table. They both looked up to see Mike standing there, his face pale but his expression unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone neutral but tight. Maya frowned. "What for?" Mike ignored her question and slid into the seat across from Robert. He pulled out his phone and placed it on the table, the screen still showing the case file. He turned it toward Robert. "You recognize this?" Mike asked, his voice low. Robert's eyes flicked to the screen, and his jaw tightened. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Yeah, I recognize it. And I recognize you now, too." Maya looked between them, confusion etched on her face. "What's going on? What is this?" Mike didn't answer her directly. Instead, he leaned forward, locking eyes with Robert. "My father was one of the officers on that case." Robert's expression hardened, the warmth from earlier replaced by a cold resolve. "I figured as much. You've got that same look in your eyes, the same arrogance." The tension at the table was suffocating. Maya's heart raced as she tried to piece together what they were talking about. "Uncle Robert, what is this? What case?" Robert exhaled slowly, glancing at his niece. "It was a long time ago, Maya. Your mum and I were kids when it happened. I got into it with the police over something I didn't do. They shot me, arrested me, and tried to paint me as the bad guy, but they couldn't make it stick." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had always known her uncle carried scars from his past, both physical and emotional, but he rarely spoke about them. Mike's voice cut through the silence. "I read the file. It doesn't exactly paint you as innocent." Robert leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "The file says whatever they wanted it to say. You weren't there. You don't know how your father and his buddies treated me, treated our whole neighborhood. But let me tell you something. People like you, who think they're above it all, you don't scare me." Maya placed a hand on Robert's arm, her voice trembling. "Uncle Robert, stop. Please." But Mike wasn't backing down. "Look, I'm not here to fight. I just want to understand what's going on, why you're here, why this feels like more than a coincidence." Robert smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe it is. Or maybe it's fate putting you in a position to finally face the truth about the man you've been idolizing all your life." Maya's voice broke through the tense standoff. "Stop it, both of you. I don't know what this is about, but it's tearing me apart." As tears welled in her eyes, Robert and Mike exchanged a long, heavy look. Neither of them realized that the connection between them was about to grow even more complicated and much more personal. The diner's air felt heavier than ever, as if the tension at the booth could suffocate everyone in the room. Maya stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "What is wrong with you two?" she snapped, her voice trembling. "Why are you dragging me into whatever this is? I deserve answers." Robert sighed deeply, the strength in his demeanor faltering as he looked at Maya. I didn't want you to carry this, kiddo. You've been through enough without adding my battles to the list. Maya folded her arms, her voice breaking. I'm not a kid, Uncle Robert. I've got a right to know what's happening. Mike sat silently, his jaw tight as his gaze shifted between the two of them. Finally, he spoke, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Maybe you do, but I need to understand something first. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Robert. Why didn't you press charges? You had witnesses. You had the truth. Why let it go? Robert's laughter was bitter and hollow. Press charges? Against a system that was built to protect your father and people like him? You think the truth would have mattered in court? Back then, a black man's word wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Maya flinched at the harshness in his tone, but she didn't interrupt. She needed to hear this. Robert continued, his voice growing quieter, but no less intense. Your father came into my neighborhood with a badge and a gun, thinking he could do whatever he wanted. He made sure I knew I was nothing in his eyes, and when I tried to walk away, he and his partner made sure I'd never forget what happens to people like me who don't bow their heads. Mike's throat tightened as the weight of Robert's words settled over him. He wanted to argue, to defend his father, but the bitterness in Robert's voice left no room for doubt. And now, Robert said, his eyes narrowing, his son walks into this diner, spewing the same hatred, thinking he's better than the people around him, like father, like son. Mike's composure cracked. That's not fair, he snapped. I'm not my father. I didn't even know about this until today. Robert leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. Maybe you didn't know. But you've been carrying his poison with you your whole life, and you don't even see it. Maya sat down slowly, her voice barely a whisper. So, what does this mean for us? Both men looked at her, their tension momentarily replaced by confusion. What are you talking about? Robert asked. Maya hesitated, her hands trembling as she stared at the table. I was going to tell you both, but now I don't know how. The silence was deafening as Maya finally looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting Mike's. I found out a few months ago, she said, her voice breaking. Mike, your dad, and my mom. She stopped, choking on the words. Mike's heart sank as dread twisted in his gut. What are you saying, Maya? She took a deep breath, her voice trembling. Your father and my mom had a relationship before he met your mother, and I'm the result. The diner erupted into silence, the weight of her words crashing down like thunder. Mike stared at her, his mind reeling. No, that's not possible. Robert's face darkened, his jaw clenched as his protective instincts kicked in. Maya, are you sure about this? She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I've got the letters, the photos, it's all there. Mike stood abruptly, his chair clattering to the floor. His face was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and confusion. You're telling me we're siblings? Maya didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes. Robert's voice was calm but cold. Guess that makes things even more complicated, doesn't it, Officer Reynolds? Mike staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter for support. The room spun as he tried to process the truth, but one thought screamed louder than the rest. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his family and Maya, was a lie. Mike leaned heavily against the counter, his breath shallow and uneven. The revelation hit him like a tidal wave, threatening to pull him under. He stared at Maya, his voice trembling as he spoke. You're saying, we share the same blood? Maya nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I didn't want you to find out like this. I've been holding it in for months, trying to figure out how to tell you. Mike's mind raced with memories of his father, family dinners, proud moments, and the stories he'd told about his time on the force. Those stories were now tainted with lies and a legacy of pain he couldn't ignore. Robert, ever the protector, broke the silence. So what now, Mike? You just found out you've got a black sister. How does that fit into your worldview? Mike's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. What my family has been through. Exactly, Robert shot back. And you don't know a damn thing about what Maya's been through either. But now you've got a chance to change that. Question is, are you man enough to take it? Maya raised a trembling hand. Stop it, both of you. This isn't about your egos or your grudges. This is about figuring out how we move forward. Her words hung in the air, a lifeline tethering the three of them to the moment. Mike drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of town, the night sky above offering no solace. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, shame, and confusion. The racism he'd carried, the legacy of his father, and now the truth about Maya. It all felt like too much. He pulled over at the edge of a park, staring out at the dark expanse. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from his mother. We need to talk about your father. There are things I should have told you long ago. Mike stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. He hadn't told her what he'd learned yet, but it seemed she already knew. Maya sat at her kitchen table, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. Robert sat across from her, his hand resting on hers. I didn't mean for it to come out like that, she said, her voice shaky. I couldn't keep it in anymore. Robert gave her a reassuring smile. You did the right thing, kid. Truth has a way of coming out, whether we're ready or not. But what if he can't handle it? Maya asked, tears slipping down her cheeks. What if this just makes everything worse? Robert sighed. That's on him. But don't you ever think for a second that you're not worth fighting for, Maya. You're stronger than you know. The next morning, Mike walked into the diner, his face pale but determined. He spotted Maya at the counter, her back turned as she wiped down tables. Maya, he called out, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She turned, startled by his presence. Mike, what are you doing here? He hesitated, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. I needed to talk to you. To apologize. Maya blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. Apologize. Mike nodded, stepping closer. I've been wrong. About you. About a lot of things. And finding out the truth about us. It's shaken me. But I want to do better. I need to do better. Maya stared at him, her heart conflicted. It's not that easy, Mike. You can't just undo years of hate with a few words. I know, he said quickly. But I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can change. Before she could respond, Robert walked in, his eyes narrowing as he saw Mike. What are you doing here? Mike turned to face him, his stance less defensive than before. I came to make things right. Robert folded his arms. That's a tall order, Officer Reynolds. Mike met his gaze, the arrogance in his demeanor replaced with quiet resolve. Maybe, but I'm ready to start. As the three of them stood in the diner, the morning light streaming through the windows, the tension slowly began to ease. But the journey ahead was far from over. Maya finally spoke, her voice steady but cautious. If you're serious about this, Mike, it's going to take more than words. You've got to face the truth, not just about me, but about yourself and your father. Mike nodded. I know, and I will. Starting now. As the conversation unfolded, none of them noticed the diner's manager, Linda, watching from the doorway. In her hands was an old photo, one of Maya's mother and Mike's father, smiling together in what seemed like another lifetime. The truth was far deeper than any of them realized, and the journey to healing would reveal even more secrets about their families and themselves. Sometimes, the hardest truths bring the greatest opportunities for change. For Mike, Maya, and Robert, the road ahead was uncertain, but it was a road worth walking, together.